A little girl with cancer saves a millionaire's life after a terrible accident. 2 days later, she receives a briefcase. Inside, there's something that will change her life forever. Watch until the end to find out what's inside. Subscribe to the channel to support my work and comment the name of the person you love the most. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor cast harsh shadows on Emily's pale face as she sat in her usual wheelchair, her small frame dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding her. At 8 years old, she had spent more time in hospital rooms than on playgrounds, more hours connected to IV drips than holding toys. Her mother Lisa stood behind her, dark circles under her eyes betraying countless sleepless nights spent watching her daughter battle against an enemy that showed no mercy. "Mrs. Thompson," a nurse approached them, her expression carefully neutral. "The doctor will see you now about the test results." Lisa's hands tightened on the wheelchair handles, her knuckles turning white. The last round of chemotherapy had been particularly brutal on Emily, and they both knew what another failed treatment would mean. As they entered the doctor's office, Emily reached up to adjust the colorful bandana covering her head, a brave attempt to hide what the aggressive medications had taken from her. Dr. Martinez sat behind his desk, a stack of papers before him that held Emily's fate in their clinical language and cold numbers. He looked up as they entered, and Lisa's heart sank when she saw his expression. She had become an expert at reading doctors' faces over the years, and this one spoke of news she wasn't ready to hear. "The latest results aren't what we hoped for," he began gently. "The cancer is showing resistance to the current treatment protocol." Lisa felt her legs weaken, but she remained standing. She had to stay strong for Emily. What are our options?" The doctor leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "There are experimental treatments we could try, but..." He glanced at the papers on his desk, then back at Lisa. "I have to be honest with you. Your insurance has already maxed out, and these treatments..." "I'll find a way," Lisa interrupted, her voice cracking. "I'll work extra shifts. I'll sell everything. Mom?" Emily's small voice cut through the tension. She turned in her wheelchair to look up at her mother, her eyes too wise for her young age. "It's okay. Don't cry." Lisa hadn't even realized she was crying until she felt the tears on her cheeks. She quickly wiped them away, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass on her face. This wasn't supposed to be her reality, watching her child console her when it should have been the other way around. That evening, as they returned to their small apartment, Lisa found another stack of bills waiting in the mailbox. Medical expenses, past due notices, and finally, the one she had been dreading most, an eviction notice. She stuffed them all into her purse before Emily could see them, but the weight of them felt like stones dragging her down. Emily's small voice broke through her thoughts. "Can we go to the park tomorrow, Mom, just for a little while?" Lisa looked at her daughter, at the hope in those eyes that had seen too much suffering, and nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. Just for a little while." That night, after tucking Emily into bed, Lisa sat at their small kitchen table, spreading out the bills before her like a deck of cards in a losing hand. The numbers blurred as fresh tears fell. The eviction notice gave them 3 days to vacate. 3 days to find a miracle in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. She pulled out her phone, dialing the hospital's billing department for what felt like the 100th time. "Please," she whispered into the receiver, "there has to be something we can do. She's all I have." The voice on the other end was sympathetic, but firm. Without insurance or immediate payment, they couldn't continue Emily's treatment. Lisa hung up the phone and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. In the next room, she could hear Emily's labored breathing, a reminder that time was running out. Tomorrow, she would take Emily to the park, as promised. She would watch her daughter try to enjoy what childhood she had left, and she would smile through her breaking heart. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of their kitchen, Lisa allowed herself to crumble under the weight of a burden no mother should have to bear. She didn't know that tomorrow would bring an encounter that would change everything, that fate was about to intervene in the most unexpected way. For now, she sat alone in the darkness, praying for a miracle she didn't believe would come, while her daughter slept in the next room, dreaming of parks and playgrounds she might never get to enjoy again. The morning dawned grey and cool, with a light drizzle that painted the city streets in glistening shadows. Lisa pushed Emily's wheelchair along the cracked sidewalk toward the small neighborhood park, trying to avoid the deeper puddles that could splash her daughter's already fragile body. The park was deserted at this early hour, the wet slides and empty swings standing like silent sentinels in the morning mist. "Look, Mom!" Emily pointed to a cluster of dandelions pushing through a crack in the concrete. "They're growing even though no one planted them." Her voice was weaker than it had been even a week ago, but her eyes still held that spark of wonder that broke Lisa's heart every time she saw it. Lisa forced herself to smile, remembering how Emily used to run through fields of dandelions, her laughter echoing across summer afternoons that now felt like memories from another lifetime. The weight of the eviction notice seemed to press against her chest, making it hard to breathe. They had only 2 days left now, and she still had no solution. As they approached the crosswalk near the park's entrance, Emily suddenly gripped the armrest of her wheelchair. "Mom, that man," she whispered, pointing across the street. Lisa followed her daughter's gaze to see a tall man in an expensive suit talking on his phone, pacing back and forth on the opposite sidewalk. He seemed agitated, gesturing with his free hand as he spoke. "Emily, it's not polite to point." Lisa gently lowered her daughter's hand, but something about the man caught her attention too. He seemed out of place in their working-class neighborhood, his tailored suit and polished shoes speaking of a world far removed from their daily struggles. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The man, still absorbed in his phone conversation, stepped off the curb without looking. The screech of tires pierced the morning quiet as a delivery van, trying to make an early morning schedule, came barreling around the corner. The driver slammed on his brakes, but the wet roads offered no traction. "Look out!" Emily's scream cut through the air, but it was too late. The van struck the man, sending him flying several feet before he crumpled to the ground like a discarded puppet. The driver jumped out, already calling 911, his face pale with shock. Before Lisa could stop her, Emily was pushing herself out of her wheelchair. Her legs, weakened by months of illness, barely supported her as she stumbled toward the fallen man. "Emily, no!" Lisa called out, terrified that her daughter would hurt herself, but Emily was already by the man's side. She knelt beside him, her small hand finding his. "Stay with me," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Help is coming. You have to stay awake." The man's eyes fluttered open, focusing hazily on the small, bandana-clad angel who had appeared beside him. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, and his expensive suit was now stained with street grime. "What's your name?" Emily asked, maintaining her grip on his hand as sirens wailed in the distance. "I'm Emily. You're going to be okay, but you have to stay awake." Jonathan, he managed to whisper before his eyes closed again. Emily kept talking to him, her voice steady, despite her obvious exhaustion, until the ambulance arrived. The paramedics worked quickly, loading Jonathan onto a stretcher, while one of them gently tried to move Emily aside. "She needs medical attention too," Lisa told them, noting how pale her daughter had become from the exertion. "She's a patient at St. Mary's. She has cancer." The last words came out as barely a whisper, but the paramedics understood. They helped Emily back into her wheelchair and insisted on taking her to the hospital as well, just to be safe. As they rode in the ambulance behind Jonathan's, Lisa held her daughter's hand, watching her struggle to keep her eyes open. The excitement and effort had drained what little energy she had, but there was something different in her expression. A sense of purpose Lisa hadn't seen in months. At the hospital, they were quickly separated from Jonathan, who was rushed into emergency surgery. A nurse Lisa recognized from the oncology ward found them in the waiting room and insisted on checking Emily's vitals. The news wasn't good. Her pulse was rapid, her blood pressure low, and her temperature elevated. "We should admit her," the nurse said quietly to Lisa. "Her counts are probably too low for her to be out of the hospital anyway." The words hung in the air like a heavy curtain, reminding Lisa of all they had been trying to escape. She looked at her phone. No missed calls from potential employers, no messages offering help, just another reminder from her bank about her overdrawn account. Emily, fighting to stay awake in her wheelchair, looked up at her mother. "Can we stay until we know if he's okay? Please." Her eyes, though tired, held a determination Lisa couldn't refuse. They had so little left. Maybe letting Emily hold on to this one act of kindness was worth whatever it might cost them. Hours passed in the sterile hospital waiting room. Lisa tried not to think about their apartment, about the boxes she should be packing, about the impossibility of their situation. Instead, she watched her daughter, who insisted on staying awake despite her exhaustion, waiting for news about a stranger whose life she might have saved. Finally, a doctor emerged, looking tired but relieved. "Mr. Blackwood is stable," he announced to the waiting room, which had filled with what appeared to be business associates of Jonathan's. "The surgery was successful, and he's expected to make a full recovery." Emily smiled weakly, slumping in her wheelchair, as if this news was all she had been holding on for. As Lisa watched her daughter finally give in to sleep, she had no way of knowing that this chance encounter would set in motion events that would change their lives forever. For now, she was just grateful that Emily had found a moment of purpose in their increasingly desperate situation. What she didn't notice was one of Jonathan's associates taking a picture of Emily sleeping in her wheelchair, or the urgent phone calls being made from the waiting room. She didn't know that in his post-surgery haze, Jonathan Blackwood was already asking about the little girl who had held his hand on the wet pavement, or that his considerable resources were being mobilized to find out everything about the child who had refused to let him give up. As night fell over the hospital, Lisa finally allowed herself to close her eyes, one arm protectively draped over her sleeping daughter. Tomorrow would bring more battles, more impossible choices, more heartbreak. But for now, in this moment, they had done something good in a world that had shown them so little kindness. She couldn't know that this single act of compassion would soon return to them multiplied beyond their wildest dreams. The next morning brought no relief from their situation. Emily's condition had worsened overnight, her fever spiking to dangerous levels. The doctors insisted on admitting her immediately, and Lisa watched helplessly as her daughter was wheeled away for yet another round of tests. The hospital halls seemed to close in around her as she realized they had nowhere else to go. Their time had run out. In her pocket, the eviction notice crumpled beneath her trembling fingers. Today was their last day. Back at their apartment, whatever belongings they hadn't sold for medical bills would be placed on the curb. Lisa sank into a hard plastic chair in the hospital corridor, her head in her hands. She had failed to protect her daughter, failed to provide a home, failed at the most basic duties of motherhood. "Mrs. Thompson," a nurse touched her shoulder gently. "Emily's asking for you. She's settled in room 412 now." Lisa nodded, wiping her eyes quickly before following the nurse. She had to be strong for Emily. She couldn't let her daughter see her breaking. Emily lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller than ever against the stark white sheets. Various machines beeped steadily around her, their rhythmic sounds a cruel reminder of how dependent her daughter's life was on medical intervention. Despite her obvious discomfort, Emily managed a weak smile when she saw her mother. "Mum, did anyone tell us if Mr. Blackwood is okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Even now, sick as she was, Emily's first thoughts were for others. Lisa's heart clenched painfully in her chest. "I haven't heard anything, sweetheart. Try to rest now." Lisa smoothed Emily's blanket, noticing how her daughter's collarbones protruded sharply beneath her hospital gown. When had she become so thin? How had Lisa not noticed? The day dragged on endlessly. Lisa made several desperate phone calls from the hospital corridor, to distant relatives, to churches, to shelters. No one had room for a sick child and her mother. Some promised to call back. Others made excuses. A few simply hung up. Around midday, Dr. Martinez appeared with a grave expression. "Mrs. Thompson, could we speak privately?" Lisa's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to follow him to a small consultation room. The doctor closed the door behind them, and Lisa braced herself for more bad news. "Emily's latest blood work is concerning," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "The cancer is progressing more rapidly than we anticipated. Without immediate intensive treatment," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "we may be looking at weeks rather than months." Lisa felt the room spin around her. Weeks, not months, not years, weeks. "But the treatment," she stammered. "You said there were options." Dr. Martinez's expression softened with sympathy. "Mrs. Thompson, Lisa, I understand you're in a difficult financial situation, but without insurance or ability to pay, our hands are tied. The hospital board," he spread his hands helplessly, "the most we can offer now is palliative care." Lisa's legs gave out, and she sank into a chair. Palliative care. They were giving up. They were going to let her daughter die because she couldn't pay their bills. "Please," she whispered, "there has to be something, anything." "I wish I could do more," Dr. Martinez said quietly. "I truly do. I'll make sure she's comfortable, and we'll manage her pain. That's the best I can offer right now." Lisa barely remembered leaving the consultation room. She wandered the hospital corridors in a daze, unable to face returning to Emily's room. How could she look her daughter in the eye, knowing she had failed to secure the treatment that could save her life? How could she watch her child slip away, knowing that somewhere out there the medicine that could save her existed but was out of reach? She found herself in the hospital chapel, though she hadn't consciously decided to go there. The small room was empty, silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Lisa sank into a pew and finally let herself break down completely, her sobs echoing in the empty space. "Why?" she cried out to the empty chapel. "She's just a baby. She's never hurt anyone. Why her?" No answer came, just the steady hum of the air conditioning and the sound of her own ragged breathing. Hours passed, though Lisa lost track of time. Eventually, she knew she had to return to Emily's room. Her daughter needed her, and she couldn't hide forever. As she walked back through the hospital corridors, she overheard snippets of conversation about Jonathan Blackwood. Apparently, he was something of a local celebrity, a wealthy businessman known for his ruthless corporate dealings. When Lisa reached Emily's room, she found her daughter sleeping fitfully, her face flushed with fever. A nurse was adjusting her IV, marking numbers on a chart. "Has she been asking for me?" Lisa whispered, guilt gnawing at her for being away so long. The nurse shook her head. "She's been sleeping mostly, but there have been some people asking about her." At Lisa's alarmed look, the nurse quickly added, "From Mr. Blackwood's office. Apparently he's been asking about the little girl who helped him after the accident. His assistant dropped this off." She handed Lisa a business card with a handwritten note on the back. "Please call regarding Emily Thompson. Urgent." The card was heavy, expensive looking, with Jonathan Blackwood's name embossed in gold letters. Lisa stared at the card, turning it over in her hands. What could a wealthy businessman want with them? Was this some sort of liability issue? Would they try to blame Emily somehow for the accident? She couldn't handle any more problems, not now. A small sound from the bed drew her attention. Emily was stirring, her eyes fluttering open. "Mom," she called weakly. "Is that you?" Lisa quickly tucked the card into her pocket and moved to her daughter's bedside. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." She took Emily's small hand in hers, noting how hot it felt, how fragile the bones seemed beneath the skin. "Mom, I had a dream," Emily whispered, her eyes struggling to focus. "I dreamed about angels. They said everything was going to be okay." Her voice drifted off as she fell back into a fevered sleep. Lisa touched her daughter's burning forehead, tears sliding down her cheeks. The business card seemed to burn in her pocket, a reminder of a world so different from theirs, a world where people had choices and options and hope. Outside the hospital windows, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Another day was ending, and they were still here, still fighting, still losing. Lisa didn't know that across town, in another hospital room, Jonathan Blackwood was also watching the sunset, his mind consumed with thoughts of a brave little girl who had refused to let him give up. She couldn't know that at that very moment, Jonathan was making calls of his own, setting things in motion that would change everything. For now, she could only hold her daughter's hand and pray for a miracle she no longer believed would come, while the business card in her pocket offered a chance she was too afraid to take. Dawn crept through the hospital windows, casting long shadows across Emily's room. Lisa hadn't slept, spending the night watching her daughter's labored breathing and listening to the steady beep of monitors. The business card from Jonathan Blackwood's office lay untouched on the windowsill where she'd placed it, almost accusingly. A soft knock on the door startled her. A nurse entered, followed by two burly men in suits who looked distinctly out of place in the pediatric ward. "Mrs. Thompson," one of them asked quietly, mindful of Emily's sleep. "Mr. Blackwood would like to speak with you. It's important." Lisa glanced at Emily, reluctant to leave her side. The nurse stepped forward. "I'll stay with her," she offered. "She'll be fine for a few minutes." Following the men through the hospital corridors felt surreal. They led her to a private room in another wing, where Jonathan Blackwood sat propped up in bed, his head bandaged and his arm in a sling. Despite his injuries, he carried himself with an air of authority that made Lisa instantly self-conscious of her rumpled clothes and unwashed hair. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, gesturing to a chair beside his bed with his good hand, "please sit down. We have much to discuss." His voice was kind but businesslike, the voice of someone used to making decisions that affected others' lives. Lisa perched on the edge of the chair, her hands twisting in her lap. "Mr. Blackwood, if this is about the accident, Emily was just trying to help." "This isn't about the accident," he interrupted gently. "This is about helping your daughter." "What?" He picked up a folder from his bedside table, wincing slightly at the movement. "I've had my people look into Emily's situation. Stage 4 neuroblastoma, diagnosed at age 5. Multiple rounds of failed chemotherapy. Insurance maxed out. Eviction notice served 3 days ago." Lisa felt her face burn with shame. Having their struggles laid out so clinically by a stranger made them seem even more overwhelming. "We're managing," she said stiffly, though they both knew it was a lie. "No," Jonathan said firmly, "you're not, and you shouldn't have to manage alone." He opened the folder, revealing medical documents Lisa recognized. Emily's records. "There's a treatment center in Cleveland specializing in aggressive childhood cancers. They're doing promising work with experimental therapies. I've spoken with their chief oncologist this morning." Lisa's head spun. "How did you get those records? Those are private?" "I have resources, Mrs. Thompson. Resources I'd like to put at Emily's disposal." He set the folder aside and looked at her intently. "Your daughter saved my life. She didn't have to stop. She didn't have to stay with me, but she did, despite her own illness. That kind of compassion, it's rare, special." Tears welled in Lisa's eyes. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but we can't accept." "You can, and you will," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "I've already made arrangements." The treatment center is expecting you. There's an apartment near the hospital, furnished, all utilities included. A car service will handle transportation. All expenses will be covered." Lisa stood abruptly, overwhelmed. Why? Why would you do this for strangers? Jonathan was quiet for a moment, looking past her at something only he could see. "Mrs. Thompson, I've spent my life building wealth, acquiring power, making deals. I thought that was what mattered. But lying there on that wet pavement, looking up at your daughter's face, for the first time in decades, I saw real humanity, pure, unconditional kindness. She showed me something I'd forgotten existed." The sincerity in his voice made Lisa sink back into her chair. "But the cost, it must be astronomical." "Money is just money," he said dismissively. "I have more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. What I don't have is time to waste arguing about this. Emily's condition is deteriorating. The sooner we get her to Cleveland, the better her chances." As if to emphasize his point, an urgent call came over the hospital PA system. "Code Blue, room 412. Code Blue, room 412. Lisa's heart stopped. Room 412 was Emily's room. She ran from Jonathan's room, her feet pounding against the hospital floor. Behind her, she could hear him calling for his people to move quickly, to implement something called Protocol Alpha. But she couldn't focus on anything except getting to her daughter. The scene that greeted her in Emily's room was nightmarish. Medical staff crowded around the bed, performing chest compressions on Emily's tiny frame. The nurse who had stayed with her was pressed against the wall, tears streaming down her face. "She just stopped breathing," she whispered as Lisa pushed past her. "Emily!" Lisa tried to reach the bed, but strong hands held her back. "That's my baby! Let me go to my baby!" Time seemed to stretch and distort. Lisa watched in horror as the medical team worked on her daughter, using terms she'd learned to fear. "No pulse. Push another round of epi. Continue compressions." Emily's small body jerked with each compression, looking more fragile than ever. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, a steady beep returned to the monitors. The doctor in charge stepped back, wiping his brow. "We have her back," he announced, "but she's very weak. Her system is shutting down." Lisa collapsed against the wall, her legs unable to support her. Through her tears, she saw new people entering the room. Efficient-looking men and women in suits, carrying tablets and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. One of them approached her directly. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Sarah Chen, Mr. Blackwood's Chief of Operations. We have a medical transport helicopter standing by on the roof. The treatment center in Cleveland is prepped and ready. We need your consent to move forward." Lisa looked at her daughter, so small and pale in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that were barely keeping her alive. What choice did she really have? She nodded numbly, and the room burst into activity. Everything that followed seemed to happen in fast forward. Emily was stabilized for transport, papers were signed, equipment was moved. Within an hour, Lisa found herself on a helicopter, holding her daughter's hand as they flew through the morning sky toward Cleveland. As the helicopter cut through the clouds, Lisa thought about Jonathan Blackwood, still in his hospital bed, mobilizing an army of people and resources to save her daughter. She didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. Everything was happening so fast, and she had no control over any of it. But looking at Emily's face, peaceful now under sedation, she knew she had to trust this chance they'd been given. Yet a nagging voice in the back of her mind wondered, what was the real price of accepting help from someone like Jonathan Blackwood? What would this miracle cost them in the end? The helicopter flew on through the morning sky, carrying them toward either salvation or something else entirely. While back in the hospital, Jonathan Blackwood made more calls, set more plans in motion, his face grave as he received updates about Emily's condition. He hadn't told Lisa everything, Not about the experimental nature of the treatments, not about the risks involved, and certainly not about the personal price he might have to pay to save her daughter's life. The Cleveland Treatment Center was a stark contrast to the community hospital they'd left behind. Everything gleamed with newness and efficiency, from the state-of-the-art medical equipment to the modern furnishings. Lisa sat in a plush chair beside Emily's bed, watching as a team of specialists examined her daughter. The private room was larger than their entire apartment had been, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Dr. Catherine Chen, the center's head oncologist, studied Emily's charts with intense concentration. Her presence commanded attention, and even the other doctors seemed to defer to her expertise. "Mrs. Thompson," she began, her voice carrying both authority and compassion, "I need to be very clear about Emily's situation. The cancer has spread aggressively, and her body is extremely weak from the previous treatments." Lisa gripped the arms of her chair, bracing for more bad news. She'd become an expert at hearing the worst while maintaining her composure. "What are her chances?" Dr. Chen glanced at Emily, who had finally fallen into a peaceful sleep after the grueling journey. "Without intervention, days, maybe a week, with aggressive treatment." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We have some experimental protocols that have shown promising results in similar cases, but I have to warn you, they're risky. The side effects can be severe, more severe than watching her die." Lisa's voice cracked despite her efforts to stay strong. "Mrs. Thompson, you need to understand. This treatment could either save her life or—" Dr. Chen left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. The treatment itself could kill Emily faster than the cancer. Before Lisa could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway. Jonathan Blackwood had arrived, against medical advice, still in a wheelchair with his injuries barely healed. His presence filled the room immediately, and Dr. Chen straightened, clearly familiar with him. "Jonathan," Dr. Chen acknowledged, "you should be in bed." "Catherine," he nodded, then turned to Lisa. "I needed to be here for this conversation. There's something we haven't told you yet." He wheeled himself closer to Emily's bed, looking at the sleeping child with an expression Lisa couldn't quite read. "The treatment Dr. Chen is proposing, it requires a bone marrow transplant. Finding a match can take months we don't have." Lisa felt her hope beginning to crumble again. "Then why—" "Because," Jonathan interrupted, "I've already been tested. I'm a match." The room fell silent. Lisa looked between Jonathan and Dr. Chen, trying to process this information. "But how is that possible? The odds of a random match are—" "1 in millions," Dr. Chen confirmed, "which is why we ran the test 3 times to be sure. Mr. Blackwood is a perfect match for Emily." Jonathan leaned forward in his wheelchair, wincing slightly. "Mrs. Thompson, Lisa, this is why I brought you here. I'm not just offering to pay for Emily's treatment. I'm offering to be her donor." Lisa stood abruptly, overwhelmed. "Mr. Blackwood, I can't ask you to do that. The procedure after your accident, it's too risky." "You're not asking, I'm offering." His voice was firm. "But there's something else you need to know." He glanced at Dr. Chen, who nodded slightly. "The accident revealed some complications in my own health. The donation process would be particularly dangerous for me. There's a significant chance that I might not—" He cleared his throat. "That there could be complications." Lisa sank back into her chair, her mind spinning. This was too much. This stranger was offering not just his money, but potentially his life to save her daughter. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk everything for us?" Jonathan was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the city below. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Lisa had ever heard it. "I've lived my life focusing on the wrong things. Money, power, success. But lying there on that pavement, looking up at Emily's face, I saw something pure, something worth sacrificing everything for." He turned back to face Lisa, his eyes intense. I've never had children of my own, never had a family. My life has been about building wealth, acquiring companies, making deals, but what's the point of all that if it can't save one child who deserves a chance at life? Dr. Chen stepped forward, her expression serious. We need to make a decision quickly. Emily's condition is critical, and if we're going to proceed with the transplant, we need to start preparing both patients immediately. Lisa looked at her daughter, so small and fragile in the hospital bed. Emily had spent half her life fighting this disease, showing more courage than anyone should have to. And now this man, this stranger who had everything to lose, was offering her a chance at life. The risks to you, she said to Jonathan, how serious are they? Given my current condition and the accident injuries. He glanced at Dr. Chen. The procedure could kill him, Dr. Chen said bluntly. His body is already compromised from the accident. The stress of the donation process might be too much. Lisa stood and walked to Emily's bedside, touching her daughter's pale cheek. Emily stirred slightly, but didn't wake, her breathing shallow and labored. If we don't do this, she asked, not taking her eyes off her daughter, how long? Days, Dr. Chen replied softly. A week at most. The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of Emily's monitors. Lisa felt the weight of the decision crushing her. How could she accept a sacrifice that might cost another person their life? But how could she refuse her daughter's only chance at survival? Jonathan wheeled himself closer to the bed. Lisa, look at me. She turned, meeting his gaze. This is my choice. Let me do this one good thing with my life. Let me give Emily a chance. Tears streamed down Lisa's face as she looked between her daughter and this man who was offering everything to save her. I don't know how to make this decision. Then let me make it for you, Jonathan said firmly. He turned to Dr. Chen. Start the preparations. I'm doing this. Dr. Chen nodded and immediately began giving orders to her team. The room burst into activity as medical staff started preparing for the complex procedure ahead. Lisa stood frozen, watching as everything was set in motion around her. She felt both grateful and terrified, blessed and cursed. Jonathan reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. It's going to be okay, he said, though they both knew he couldn't promise that. Emily's going to live. That's all that matters. As the medical team worked around them, Lisa looked down at her daughter and then at Jonathan, wondering how fate had brought them to this moment. She couldn't know that the most difficult part of their journey was still ahead, or that the true cost of this miracle would be higher than any of them could imagine. The next 3 days passed in a blur of medical preparations and rising tension. Lisa watched as both Emily and Jonathan underwent a battery of tests and procedures to prepare for the transplant. The treatment center had become their entire world, its rhythms and routines marking the passage of time as they moved inexorably toward the procedure that would either save or end lives. Emily's condition continued to deteriorate. Each breath seemed to require more effort than the last, and her once bright eyes had become dull with exhaustion. The doctors had started her on an aggressive chemotherapy regimen to prepare her body for the transplant, and the side effects were brutal. Lisa spent hours holding back her daughter's thinning hair as she retched into a hospital basin, whispering promises that everything would be okay, though her own heart was breaking. "Mom," Emily whispered during one of her more lucid moments, "is Mr. Blackwood really going to give me his bone marrow?" Lisa smoothed her daughter's blanket, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, sweetheart. He wants to help you get better." Emily was quiet for a moment, her face thoughtful, despite the pain she was clearly in. "But what if something bad happens to him? I don't want anyone to get hurt because of me." The innocent concern in her daughter's voice made Lisa's chest tighten. Even now, facing her own mortality, Emily's first thought was for others. "Mr. Blackwood made his own choice, honey. He wants to do this. Down the hall, in another wing of the treatment center, Jonathan was fighting his own battles. His body, still recovering from the accident, struggled with the preparation procedures. Lisa had visited him several times, watching with growing concern as he became noticeably weaker, yet his determination never wavered. During one visit, she found him reviewing legal documents with his lawyer, signing paper after paper with a trembling hand. He looked up when she entered, quickly having the lawyer leave them alone. "Just taking care of some details," he said, attempting to sound casual despite his obvious exhaustion. "Everything needs to be in order, just in case." Lisa sat in the chair beside his bed, guilt gnawing at her. "You don't have to do this. We can still stop." "No," he interrupted firmly. "We can't. Emily's already started the preparatory treatments. Stopping now would kill her faster than the cancer." He reached for a glass of water, his hand shaking so badly that Lisa had to help him drink. "Besides, my mind is made up." Dr. Chen had been brutally honest about the risks to both patients. The high-dose chemotherapy necessary to prepare Emily's body for the transplant would destroy her immune system completely. She would be completely vulnerable to any infection during the critical period after the transplant, and Jonathan's weakened condition made him a high-risk donor. The procedure would place an enormous strain on his system, one that his doctors weren't sure he could survive. The night before the scheduled transplant, Lisa couldn't sleep. She paced the halls of the treatment center, her mind racing with fears and doubts. She found herself in the hospital's small chapel, just as she had back in their hometown hospital. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Sarah Chen, Jonathan's chief of operations, sat in one of the back pews, her usually perfect composure showing cracks of worry. She looked up as Lisa entered but didn't speak. They sat in silence for several minutes before Sarah finally broke it. "I've worked for Jonathan for 15 years, she said quietly. "I've seen him make billion-dollar deals without blinking. I've watched him tear down entire companies without remorse. But I've never seen him like this." Lisa turned to look at her. "Like what?" "At peace." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's like he's finally found something worth more than all the wealth he's accumulated." She stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "He made me promise to look after everything. To make sure you and Emily would be taken care of." The implication of her words hit Lisa like a physical blow. "He really thinks he's going to die, doesn't he?" Sarah met her eyes steadily. "He thinks it's worth the risk. That's all that matters to him now." The morning of the transplant dawned cold and grey. The treatment center was eerily quiet as final preparations were made. Emily had been moved to a sterile isolation room where she would stay during the critical post-transplant period. Through the glass walls, Lisa watched as nurses in protective gear checked her daughter's vital signs and adjusted her medications. Jonathan was being prepared in another room down the hall. Dr. Chen moved between both patients, her face showing the strain of what they were about to attempt. The procedure itself would take several hours, first harvesting the bone marrow from Jonathan, then processing it, and finally transfusing it into Emily. Just before they were about to begin, Jonathan asked to see Emily one last time. Against medical advice, they wheeled his bed to the doorway of her isolation room. Emily was barely conscious, the preparatory treatments having taken a devastating toll on her small body. "Hey, kiddo," Jonathan called softly. Emily's eyes fluttered open, focusing on him with effort. "Remember when you helped me after my accident? How you stayed with me and kept me fighting?" His voice grew thick with emotion. "Well, now it's my turn to help you fight. You just have to promise me one thing." "What?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Promise me you'll live. Promise me you'll grow up and have all the adventures and experiences I never had time for. Can you do that for me?" Emily managed a tiny nod, a ghost of her former smile crossing her face. "I promise." The medical team began to separate them then, wheeling Jonathan toward the operating room where they would harvest his bone marrow. As they passed Lisa, he reached out and caught her hand. "Whatever happens," he said intensely, "know that this was my choice, my gift. Don't ever let Emily feel guilty about it." Before Lisa could respond, they were wheeling him away. She stood in the hallway, feeling more alone than ever, watching as they took him through the operating room doors. The last glimpse she had of him was his face, set with determination despite his obvious fear. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. Lisa alternated between sitting with Emily and pacing the halls, jumping every time a doctor or nurse hurried past. Sarah Chen appeared occasionally with updates, her professional demeanor cracking a little more each time. Finally, Dr. Chen emerged from the operating room, her surgical mask still in place. Lisa couldn't read her expression, couldn't tell if the news was good or bad. The doctor pulled her into a private consultation room, and Lisa felt her heart stop, waiting to hear whether their miracle had come at the ultimate price. Dr. Chen's face was etched with exhaustion as she closed the consultation room door behind them. Her surgical scrubs bore traces of the grueling hours she'd spent in the operating room, and her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she gestured for Lisa to sit down. "The bone marrow harvest was successful," she began, her voice carrying the weight of more news to come. "We were able to collect enough healthy cells for the transplant. Emily is receiving them now." Lisa leaned forward, her heart pounding. "And Mr. Blackwood?" Dr. Chen's hesitation spoke volumes. "He's in critical condition. The procedure put an enormous strain on his system, especially given his accident injuries. We've moved him to intensive care, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The next 24 hours will be crucial for both of them." The following days became a nightmare of waiting and watching. Lisa divided her time between 2 intensive care units, watching both her daughter and her daughter's savior fight for their lives. Emily remained in isolation, her compromised immune system making her vulnerable to the slightest infection. Through the glass walls of her sterile room, Lisa could only watch as her daughter battled fever, nausea, and pain, the brutal side effects of the transplant process. Jonathan's condition deteriorated rapidly. His body, already weakened by the accident and the harvest procedure, struggled to maintain basic functions. Machines breathed for him, monitored his heart, and pumped medications through his veins. The steady beep of monitors became a constant soundtrack to Lisa's vigil, each sound a reminder of how precarious both lives had become. Sarah Chen practically lived at the hospital now, managing Jonathan's business empire from a makeshift office in the waiting room. Lisa often found her late at night, surrounded by laptops and phones, dark circles under her eyes as she tried to keep Jonathan's companies running while their leader lay unconscious. "He knew," Sarah confided one night, her professional facade cracking. "He knew exactly what this might cost him, but he did it anyway. In 15 years, I've never seen him so sure about anything." On the 5th day after the transplant, Emily's fever spiked dangerously high. Lisa watched in helpless terror as medical teams rushed in and out of the isolation room, their protective suits making them look like astronauts on a desperate mission. Through the glass, she could see her daughter's small body convulsing with chills, her skin burning with infection. Dr. Chen spent hours at Emily's bedside, adjusting medications and monitoring her responses. "Her body is fighting the new cells," she explained to Lisa. "It's normal, but in Emily's weakened state." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew how delicate the balance was. Down the hall, Jonathan's condition continued to worsen. His kidney function was declining, and his doctors were discussing the possibility of dialysis. Lisa felt torn between the 2 rooms, between the child she had given birth to and the man who had given everything to save her. One afternoon, while sitting beside Jonathan's bed, Lisa noticed his hand move slightly. His eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with difficulty. "Emily," he managed to whisper through his oxygen mask. "Fighting," Lisa told him, taking his hand. "Just like you taught her." A ghost of a smile crossed his face before he slipped back into unconsciousness. It would be the last time she saw him awake. That night, Emily's fever finally broke. Dr. Chen's face showed cautious optimism as she reviewed the latest test results. "The new cells are starting to engraft," she announced. "Her body is accepting the transplant." But the celebration was short-lived. Just past midnight, alarms began blaring in Jonathan's room. Lisa watched in horror as medical teams rushed in, beginning chest compressions as his heart failed. Through the windows, she could see them working frantically, using defibrillators, pushing medications, fighting to bring him back. Sarah arrived moments later, her face pale with shock. They stood together in the hallway, watching the medical team's desperate efforts. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the sound of alarms and shouted medical terms blending into a nightmare cacophony. Finally, Dr. Chen emerged from the room, pulling off her protective gear with shaking hands. The look on her face told them everything before she could speak. "I'm so sorry," she began, but Sarah was already turning away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Lisa felt her legs give way, and she sank to the floor of the hallway. The magnitude of what had happened, of what Jonathan had sacrificed, crashed over her like a wave. He had known. He had known all along that this might happen, and he had chosen to do it anyway. In her isolation room, Emily slept peacefully, unaware that her salvation had come at such a terrible cost. Her body was already growing stronger, the donated cells beginning their work of rebuilding her immune system. But the price of her second chance at life was one that Lisa didn't know how to comprehend. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Lisa sat beside Emily's bed, watching her daughter's peaceful sleep through the glass walls of the isolation room. The monitors showed strong, vital signs, and Emily's color was better than it had been in months. Dr. Chen's latest tests confirmed what they had hoped for. The transplant was working. Emily was going to live, but the victory felt hollow in the wake of Jonathan's sacrifice. Lisa couldn't stop thinking about their last conversation, about his insistence that this was his choice, his gift. How could she ever explain to Emily what her life had cost? How could she help her daughter carry the weight of such a sacrifice? Sarah appeared at the door of Emily's room, her eyes red from crying, but her posture professional once again. She held a thick envelope in her hands. "He left this for you," she said quietly, passing it through the airlock. "He wrote it the night before the procedure, made me promise not to give it to you until after." Lisa's hands trembled as she took the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in Jonathan's firm handwriting, though she could see places where his hand had shaken. As she began to read, tears blurred her vision, but the words would change everything she thought she knew about fate, sacrifice, and the true meaning of family. Lisa's hands trembled as she unfolded Jonathan's letter, her tears falling onto the crisp paper. His words, written in the final hours before the procedure, seemed to carry the weight of everything he'd known was coming. "Dear Lisa and Emily, if you're reading this, then things have gone exactly as I expected they might. Please don't mourn me too deeply. I want you to understand why this was the easiest decision I've ever made. 30 years ago, I made a choice that has haunted me every day since. I had a daughter, a beautiful baby girl who I gave up because I was young, ambitious, and too focused on building my empire to be the father she deserved. Her mother died in childbirth, and in my cowardice, I let my baby be adopted by another family. I told myself she would have a better life, that it was the right thing to do. I've spent every day since then trying to convince myself I made the right choice. That daughter was you, Lisa. I recognized you the moment I saw your photo in Emily's medical files. You have your mother's eyes, the same eyes I see in Emily. I had my team confirm it through DNA testing while I was being screened as a donor. That's why I'm a perfect match for Emily. She's my granddaughter. I know this must come as a shock, and perhaps you're feeling anger, betrayal, or confusion. You have every right to those feelings. I don't expect or deserve forgiveness. But please understand, when I saw Emily that day on the street, when she stayed with me after the accident, I didn't know who she was. Her kindness, her bravery, her pure heart, those were all her own, not because of any connection to me. Finding out later that she was my granddaughter felt like both a miracle and a punishment. A chance to finally do something right, to be the father and grandfather I should have been all along, but only at the cost of my own life. It seems a fitting price to pay. I've arranged everything, all my wealth, my companies, everything I built while hiding from my responsibilities. It's all yours now. Sarah will help you manage it, guide you through the transition. But more importantly, I've given Emily a chance to live, to grow up, to have all the experiences I denied you because of my selfishness. The hardest part of writing this letter is knowing I won't be there to see Emily grow up, to ask for your forgiveness in person, to try to make amends for the years I lost. But perhaps this sacrifice can begin to balance the scales. Don't let Emily carry the weight of my choice. Let her know that her grandfather loved her enough to give everything for her, that in saving her, I finally found my own salvation. With all my love and hope for your forgiveness, Jonathan. Lisa sat in stunned silence, reading the letter over and over until the words began to blur. Memories flooded back, the orphanage where she grew up, the endless questions about her parents, the hole in her heart that had never quite healed. And now, to learn that her father had been there all along, watching from afar, only to step in at the last possible moment to save her daughter. Through the glass walls of Emily's isolation room, she could see her daughter sleeping peacefully, her color improving by the day. The transplant was working. Jonathan's final gift to them both was taking hold, giving Emily the future he had once denied Lisa. Sarah appeared silently beside her, holding another envelope. "There's more," she said softly. "Records, photos, letters he kept all these years. He never stopped watching over you, Lisa. He just didn't know how to bridge the gap he'd created." Lisa opened the second envelope with shaking hands. Inside were photographs, herself as a baby, school pictures she didn't know existed, graduation photos taken from afar. Jonathan had documented her life from a distance, carrying the weight of his choice alone. "He hired private investigators to keep track of you," Sarah explained. "Made sure you were safe, happy. When you struggled as a single mother, he anonymously paid off some of your debts. When Emily got sick," she paused, swallowing hard, "he tried to find ways to help without revealing himself. But he couldn't figure out how without raising questions about why a stranger would care so much." "Until the accident," Lisa whispered. "Until the accident," Sarah confirmed. "He said it was like fate finally gave him the chance he'd been waiting for. A way to help that wouldn't raise suspicions, that would seem natural." Lisa looked back through the glass at Emily, seeing her father's features reflected in her daughter's face for the first time. How had she never noticed? The same determined set of the jaw, the same slight curve of the smile. "What do I tell her?" Lisa asked, her voice breaking. "How do I explain that her grandfather sacrificed himself for her, but only after spending years hiding from us?" Sarah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Tell her the truth, that sometimes people make mistakes, carry regrets, but love finds a way to heal even the deepest wounds. Tell her that her grandfather loved her enough to give everything to save her, and that love is his true legacy." As if sensing they were talking about her, Emily stirred in her bed. Her eyes fluttered open, clearer and more alert than they had been in weeks. She smiled when she saw Lisa through the glass, raising a weak hand to wave. Lisa pressed her hand against the glass, matching her daughter's gesture. In that moment, she felt the weight of generations, the mistakes, the love, the sacrifice, all converging in this single point of connection. Emily was alive, growing stronger every day, carrying within her cells the very essence of the grandfather she would never meet. The monitors beeped steadily, showing strong, vital signs, promising recovery. Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Lisa held Jonathan's letter close to her heart, feeling the truth of his words settling into her soul. They had lost so much time, so many chances, but in the end, love had found a way to heal not just Emily's body, but generations of wounds. Sarah watched them both through the glass, her professional mask softening with emotion. "He wanted you to know," she said quietly, "that the day of the accident wasn't the first time he saw Emily. He used to park across from her school sometimes, just to catch a glimpse of her playing at recess. He said those were the only moments he felt truly alive." Lisa's tears fell freely now, for the father she never knew, for the grandfather Emily would never meet, for the years lost and found in this final, ultimate sacrifice. The letter in her hands held not just Jonathan's last words, but the key to understanding their shared past and the bridge to their future. Through the glass, Emily smiled again, stronger this time, unaware of the magnitude of the revelations unfolding around her. She was simply happy to be feeling better, to see her mother's face, to know she was getting another chance at life. And perhaps that innocence, that pure joy in simply being alive, was Jonathan's greatest gift of all. 6 months after the transplant, Emily stood at Jonathan's grave, a bouquet of fresh dandelions in her small hands. Her hair had begun to grow back, dark and curly like her mother's, and her cheeks held a healthy flush that seemed almost miraculous after so many years of illness. Lisa watched from a few steps away as her daughter carefully arranged the wildflowers against the polished granite headstone. "Do you think he can see these, Mom?" Emily asked, her voice strong and clear, another gift from the grandfather she'd never truly known. "Sarah said he always liked simple things, even though he was rich." Lisa moved forward to stand beside her daughter, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. The past months had been a journey of healing, not just for Emily's body, but for both their souls. Telling Emily the truth had been one of the hardest things Lisa had ever done, but her daughter's response had shown wisdom beyond her years. "He saved me twice," Emily had said when Lisa finally explained everything. "Once after the accident, and once with his bone marrow. That means he must have loved us very much, even if he made mistakes before." The treatment center had become their second home during Emily's recovery. Dr. Chen monitored every milestone, every sign of improvement, with careful attention. The donated cells had taken hold completely, Jonathan's final gift continuing to work its miracle in Emily's body. Each clear test result felt like a message from him, a reminder that love could transcend even death. Sarah Chen had kept her promise to Jonathan, helping Lisa navigate the overwhelming responsibility of managing his estate. The wealth he'd left them was staggering, but more valuable were the records he'd kept, photos, letters, and journals that helped Lisa understand the father she'd never known, the man who had watched from afar, trapped by his own guilt and regret, until fate had given him one last chance at redemption. "Look, Mom!" Emily's voice broke through Lisa's thoughts. She was pointing at a dandelion growing through a crack in the concrete path near the grave. "They grow anywhere, don't they? Even in places where you wouldn't expect to find anything beautiful." Lisa felt tears well up in her eyes at her daughter's unconscious wisdom. "Yes, they do, sweetheart, just like love can grow in the most unexpected places." They had established a foundation in Jonathan's name, dedicated to helping families facing childhood cancer. The same halls where Lisa had once walked in despair now echoed with hope as other parents found the support they needed. Emily insisted on visiting whenever she had checkups, talking to other sick children, sharing her own story of survival, and the grandfather who had given everything for her. Dr. Chen had joined the Foundation's board, bringing her expertise and dedication to a wider circle of patients. The experimental treatment protocols that had saved Emily were being refined and improved, offering hope to more families. Jonathan's sacrifice had created ripples that would continue to save lives for years to come. Back at home, A modest house they'd chosen despite their newfound wealth, Lisa kept a photo on the mantel. It showed Jonathan holding Emily's hand that day in the hospital, both of them smiling despite their pain. It was the only picture they had of them together, but it captured everything that mattered: love, sacrifice, and the bridge between past and future. Sarah visited often, becoming like family herself. She shared stories about Jonathan that helped Lisa understand the complicated man who had been her father. His dedication to his work had been legendary, but in his final weeks he had found a peace that none of his wealth had ever brought him. He said meeting Emily was like being given a second chance, Sarah told them one evening, not just to save her life, but to save his own soul. Emily's recovery continued to amaze her doctors. The cancer showed no signs of returning, and her immune system grew stronger every day. She returned to school, made friends, and began living the normal childhood that had been denied her for so long. Sometimes Lisa would watch her daughter playing in the backyard and feel overwhelmed by the miracle of it all. Now, standing at the grave, Emily reached out to trace the letters of Jonathan's name on the headstone. "Mom," she said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking. When I grow up, I want to be a doctor. I want to help other kids like me, and their families too. Do you think Grandpa would like that?" Lisa knelt beside her daughter, pulling her close. "I think he would love that more than anything in the world." They stayed there as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery. A gentle breeze stirred the dandelions Emily had brought, their seeds catching the wind and floating away to find new places to grow. Lisa thought about how life was like that, how love and hope could take root in the most barren places, how mistakes and regrets could become the soil for something beautiful to grow. Jonathan's letter remained in Lisa's bedside drawer, but she knew its words by heart now. His final message had become their family's truth, that love could bridge any gap, heal any wound, and that it was never too late for redemption. As they walked back to their car, Emily slipped her hand into Lisa's. "Mom," she said, "I'm glad Grandpa found us, even if it wasn't for very long. And I'm glad we found each other too." Lisa squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling the strong pulse of life beneath the skin, life that flowed with Jonathan's last gift. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." They drove home in the gathering dusk, leaving behind the granite marker that bore Jonathan's name, but not the full measure of his legacy. That lived on in Emily's smile, in the lives touched by their foundation, in the bridges built between past and future, and in the simple truth that love, even late-blooming love, could change everything. The house was warm and welcoming when they returned, filled with photos of 3 generations, some old, some new, all precious. Emily's medical records, once a source of despair, now told a story of triumph. Her latest tests showed no trace of cancer, only the healthy cells that her grandfather had given her, multiplying and thriving, carrying his love forward into a future he would never see but had made possible. That night, as Lisa tucked Emily into bed, her daughter asked one last question. "Mom, do you think Grandpa knew we would be okay?" Lisa thought about Jonathan's letter, about his journey from cowardice to courage, from regret to redemption. "Yes," she said softly, "I think he knew exactly what he was giving us. Not just life, but a chance to be a real family, even if he couldn't be here to share it." Emily smiled sleepily, already drifting off. "Then he must have been very wise, even if he made mistakes before. Because we are okay, aren't we, Mom? We're more than okay." Lisa kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in the miracle of her presence. "Yes, sweetheart, we're more than okay. We're exactly where we're meant to be." She turned off the light, but stayed in the doorway for a moment, watching her daughter sleep. Outside, the stars were coming out, each one a point of light in the darkness, just as Jonathan had become a light in their darkest hour. His sacrifice had given them not just life, but understanding, forgiveness, and the kind of love that transcends time and death and regret. It was more than enough. It was everything.